They ruled the screen like giants. But quite a few of Hollywood's Golden Age icons barely cleared 5.5 feet, and the studios had an entire toolkit built for hiding it. Raised floors, forced perspective, tall co-stars angled just so, cameras tilted a few degrees lower than you'd expect. Most audiences never clocked it, and a handful of these actors didn't bother with any of those tricks. They simply took over a scene through nothing but presence. Here are 14 legends of the studio era, ranked by nothing in particular, whose actual height might surprise you. Some of them had entire departments dedicated to disguising it, carpenters, camera operators, and wardrobe teams all working in quiet coordination to protect an illusion. Others simply refused to play along and built entire careers on audiences knowing exactly how small they were. Both approaches worked. Let's get into it. Mickey Rooney stood around 5'2", short even by the standards of this list, and dramatically shorter than nearly every adult actor he ever worked opposite. And yet, from 1939 to 1941, he was the single biggest box office draw on the planet, outselling tickets against far taller men like Clark Gable and Gary Cooper. A director can shave off an inch or two with a hidden riser, but there's no disguising a gap that large, particularly when Rooney was routinely cast beside leading ladies taller than he was. MGM didn't even try to hide it. Instead, they let him fill the frame a different way, sideways, not up. Watch any Andy Hardy picture or Babes in Arms, and you'll see a performer in constant motion, bouncing, gesturing, singing, cracking jokes at top speed, refusing to give the eye a moment to rest. He generated so much sheer motion and noise that measuring him against a doorframe became beside the point. Where the studio system spent fortunes on trenches and forced perspective to manufacture giants, Rooney is the proof that none of it was strictly necessary. If the performance itself is big enough, nobody's counting inches. It also helped that MGM never bothered pairing him with shorter co-stars to soften the contrast. They let the mismatch sit in plain view and simply trusted the performance to carry the scene anyway. Peter Lorre. At roughly 5'5", with a soft, rounded build, Lorre had none of the sharp-edged menace typically associated with a Hollywood heavy, and physically he wasn't going to overpower anyone. But he didn't need to. His gift was psychological, not physical. True dread, he seemed to understand instinctively, comes from unpredictability, not size. Rather than raising his voice or filling up space, he did the opposite. He went still and let a thin, wheedling voice and heavy-lidded eyes do the work. Cinematographers loved to trap him in claustrophobic close-ups that cut the rest of his body out of frame entirely, and in those moments his height simply stopped registering. Audiences were too unsettled by what was happening behind his eyes. His confrontation with Bogart in The Maltese Falcon is the clearest example. Lorre is smaller, outmatched, even shoved around physically, and the scene still never feels like a clean win for Bogart. Because Lorre's quiet reptilian composure never breaks. He proved that raw size is a fairly minor weapon compared to the ability to control a scene's psychological temperature. Studios eventually built entire roles around that ability, casting him again and again as the softest spoken man in the room precisely because it made him the most unsettling one. Edward G. Robinson. The template for the American movie gangster came from a man who, on the street, might have passed for a bank manager. At 5'6", round-faced and stocky, Edward G. Robinson had none of the physical markers Hollywood typically used to signal danger. Cast purely by measurements, he'd have spent his career as a background clerk. Instead, starting with Little Caesar, he became the reigning king of the screen underworld. His method was conviction, delivered with total aggression. He didn't wait for the camera to grant him authority. He seized it, planting his feet, clenching a cigar, jutting his chin at anyone who might look down on him and firing off dialogue in a clipped, staccato growl that forced the whole scene onto his rhythm. No platforms required. His performance itself recalibrated the room's visual hierarchy. And there's a logic to why it worked so well. A towering man threatening you is just physics. A 5'6" man barking one order and silencing an entire room of armed, much larger henchmen tells you something scarier about where the real power sits. Robinson didn't overcome his height. He turned it into the whole point. Later in his career, when he moved into more sympathetic roles, that same compact intensity read as moral weight instead of menace, which says something about how much of his effect was never really about size at all. Elisha Cook Jr. If a film noir needed someone who looked doomed before the scene even started, the call went to Elisha Cook Jr. at about 5'5". He had a build that radiated vulnerability. Unlike nearly every other short leading man of the era, the studios never tried to disguise it. No risers, no low camera angles, manufacturing false authority. They leaned all the way in instead. As Wilmer, the jumpy hired gun in The Maltese Falcon, Cook is practically staged to look small. Director John Huston repeatedly frames him alongside Bogart and the enormous Sidney Greenstreet, and Cook seems to vanish inside his own overcoat, his gun looking almost too heavy for his arms. When he tries to threaten someone, he has to tip his head back to do it, and that single physical detail undercuts his menace before he says a word. We know he's out of his depth before the dialogue confirms it. In an era of stoic, immovable leading men, Cook built a long career on being the opposite, twitchy, breakable, never quite as tough as he was pretending to be. The studios didn't hide his height, because his height was the performance. It's part of why he stayed in constant work for decades. Casting directors weren't looking for someone to play tough. They were looking for someone the audience would instantly believe wasn't. Buster Keaton look. At Buster Keaton's most famous set pieces, and a pattern jumps out immediately. He's almost always positioned next to something enormous that's trying to kill him. At exactly 5'5" and built like a compact acrobat, Keaton took his stature in a very different direction than his contemporary Chaplin. Where Chaplin used smallness to earn sympathy, Keaton used it to sell scale and danger. Hollywood generally worked hard to make its leading men look like unmovable monuments. Keaton did the reverse, turning himself into the most movable object on set. Wrestling a full-sized locomotive in the General, or standing motionless as a 2-ton house facade collapses around him in Steamboat Bill Jr. He's consistently shot in wide frames that emphasize just how little space he occupies against the machinery and chaos surrounding him. A 6'2" leading man doing the same stunts reads as a hero effortlessly winning. At 5'5" and barely 140 pounds, Keaton instead reads as something fragile caught in violent, indifferent forces, and that mismatches the entire trick. His low center of gravity also gave him genuine aerodynamic control that taller performers lacked, letting him get thrown, blown, and launched across a frame while keeping his deadpan intact. No hidden platforms, no camera games. The danger itself supplied all the authority he needed. Keaton reportedly designed a number of these stunts himself, which meant the scale of the threat bearing down on his small frame was, in a very literal sense, entirely his own doing. Alan Ladd on screen. Alan Ladd reads exactly like the standard issue 1940s leading man. Broad-shouldered, icy, commanding the frame without effort. Off-screen, keeping up that illusion was a full production department's job. At around 5'5" giz, despite studio publicity insisting otherwise, Ladd had the voice and demeanor film noir demanded, and he was a genuine box office force in pictures like This Gun for Hire. But the era's unwritten rule said a tough guy hero had to physically loom over whoever he was threatening. So Paramount simply rebuilt the world around him instead. Crew members referred to the hidden wooden risers he stood on as Ladd boxes. When he had to walk alongside a taller female co-star, crew sometimes dug a shallow trench for her to walk in, effectively lowering the floor under her feet so he'd stay the tallest point in frame. Cinematographers, meanwhile, kept the lens low and angled upward to stretch his posture artificially. Unlike the character actors who thrived by embracing their real dimensions, Ladd was a marquee idol the studio had too much invested in to let him just exist at his actual size. So they reshaped the floorboards, the camera, and everyone standing near him instead. It's a strange contrast to some of the actors elsewhere on this list. The same industry that let Elisha Cook Jr. play his real height for pathos spent real money making sure Lad never had to. Sammy Davis Jr. standing next to Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Sammy Davis Jr.'s height difference was impossible to miss. Sinatra and Martin carried that tall, lounging ease effortlessly, while Davis topped out around 5'5" and barely 120 pounds. A traditional studio faced with that kind of gap would typically reach for tight close-ups or hidden platforms to manage it. None of that applied to Davis because the standard playbook assumes a static actor, and Davis was never static. Classic height illusions rely on stillness, two men squared off, matching postures. Davis instead took over the frame kinetically, rapid-fire impressions, explosive tap routines, constant motion that no taller, heavier performer in the Rat Pack could match beat for beat. He wasn't borrowing authority by puffing up or mimicking Sinatra's cool stillness. He was operating on an entirely different frequency, one where being smaller meant being faster and packing more into every second of film. Nobody's eye instinctively goes to the tallest person in a room. It goes to whoever's pulling the energy out of the air. Davis proved you don't need a cinematographer stretching your proportions if you're generating enough raw output that height simply stops being the thing anyone notices. On a stage built for cool, controlled masculinity, he was the one performer who won the room by refusing to be still for even a second. Frank McHugh. Every actor in the 1930s studio system was hired to be the hero, and Warner Brothers understood the commercial value of contrast. Put a big, broad-shouldered leading man on the poster, then surround him on set with someone who makes him look even bigger by comparison. That was Frank McHugh's job. At 5'6", with a slightly stooped posture and a permanently worried face, McHugh became the era's defining best friend, never the romantic lead, never the one who wins the fight, and that was exactly the point. Sharing a frame with a larger star, his size functioned as an instant visual cue, establishing the scene's pecking order. Audiences knew immediately he was the sidekick, the pal who'd eventually need saving. What's notable is how comfortably McHugh occupied that role. Rather than fighting for lifts or camera favors, he leaned into an ordinary grounded physicality, a signature wheezy laugh, a habitual shrug that made him look even smaller and less threatening. Far from a career demotion, it was a smart, durable strategy. He worked constantly, appeared in over 150 films, and became a fixture of the Warner Brothers stock company by never once challenging the star standing next to him. Directors trusted him precisely because they knew what they'd get, a reliable, unthreatening presence that made the leading man's dominance look effortless by comparison. Claude Rains for proof that screen command has nothing to do with physical stature. Look no further than Claude Rains in 1933's The Invisible Man, a film where, for nearly the entire runtime, his body is never visible at all, and he still dominates every scene purely through voice. At around 5'6", Rains didn't fit the physical mold of a Hollywood tough guy or romantic conqueror, but he had a classically trained theatrical voice, sharp enough to cut through any scene. He never needed volume or size, just immaculate diction and total unhurried confidence. Watch his Captain Renault opposite Bogart and Paul Henreid in Casablanca. Rains is visibly the smallest man in the shot, yet he sets the tempo. He never rushes a line, never fidgets, never competes physically for space. He simply glides in, lands a perfectly timed remark, and makes everyone else adjust to his pace. A raised eyebrow or a well-placed pause did the work that a taller frame might have done for someone else. Nobody built him a platform because his power was never structural. It was vocal, and it worked exactly the same, whether the room was full of taller men or not. Later in his career, he'd win an Oscar for a role that never asked him to throw a single punch. Proof that the industry eventually caught up to what he'd been demonstrating all along. James Cagney, 2. Understand how James Cagney dominated a scene. Don't look at his height, Look at his footwork. At roughly 5'5", Cagney had none of the bulk typically associated with Hollywood enforcers and syndicate bosses. But before Warner Brothers ever handed him a prop Tommy gun, he'd trained for years as a vaudeville dancer, and that background gave him a very particular physical edge. You don't need to be the biggest guy in the room if you're clearly the fastest. In The Public Enemy, or White Heat, he doesn't play menace by standing still and puffing out his chest. He plays it through momentum, leaning forward on the balls of his feet, moving with a quick, coiled bounce, as if he might snap at any second. If a taller actor squared up to intimidate him, Cagney didn't retreat or tilt his chin upward. He closed the gap, invading personal space with sharp, jagged movement and rapid-fire delivery that made everyone else in the scene look slow by comparison. No hidden risers were necessary because the camera itself struggled to keep pace with him. Audiences were too busy processing the sheer kinetic chaos to register that the man threatening to tear the room apart stood 5'5". He conquered scenes not by faking size, but by hitting the frame like a jolt of electricity. That dancer's training never really left him, even decades later. In roles that had nothing to do with crime, you can still see the same coiled, ready-to-move posture underneath everything he did. Lou Costello. Watch any wide shot of Abbott and Costello, and geometry tells the joke before a single line does. Bud Abbott stands rigid, tall, immaculately dressed, a wall of authority. Beside him, Lou Costello, at about 5'5", is constantly moving and looking like the world is 1 second from caving in on him. Where studio technicians usually worked hard to visually equalize mismatched heights, Universal did the exact opposite here, framing shots to emphasize the gap rather than hide it, because closing that gap would have killed the joke outright. Costello's shorter, rounder frame read instantly as vulnerable, letting the audience grasp the duo's power dynamic without a word of setup. Abbott was control. Costello was chaos. Faced with anything threatening, a confusing lineup of numbers, an actual monster, Abbott could stay upright and dismissive, while Costello folded in on himself, scrambling, ducking, hiding behind his taller partner, radiating pure panic in a way that would look absurd coming from a bigger man, but read as completely believable coming from him. Directors never needed platforms or low angles to fake him authority, because authority was never the goal. His lack of it was the entire engine of the comedy. Take that mismatch away, give Costello even an extra inch or two, and a fair number of the duo's most famous routines simply stop working. Burgess Meredith. Cast Burgess Meredith in something, and you were usually casting a man who already looked beaten by the world. At around 5'6", slight and unassuming, Meredith lacked the physical bulk to push anyone around on screen, and in Hollywood's rigid visual hierarchy that typically meant background roles. The bookish type, the nervous onlooker, the odd man out. But Meredith understood something sharper. Being underestimated is its own advantage. He rarely fought for the center of frame, often working near the edges while louder. More physically postured actors burned through their energy, and then, with a small shift in his raspy voice or a sudden calculating look, he'd quietly take the scene over. He didn't dominate a room by occupying more of it. He created a kind of gravitational pull that made the audience lean toward the smallest, quietest man in the shot. His Henry Bemis on The Twilight Zone, nearsighted, hunched, dwarfed by his boss, his wife, and a cavernous bank vault, is the purest example, without raising his voice once. He holds total command of the audience's attention. Meredith proved command isn't always outward. Sometimes it's just being the person everyone else made the mistake of overlooking. Directors who worked with him repeatedly noted the same thing. Give him the smallest entrance in the scene, and he'd somehow still be the one you remembered walking out of the theater. Charlie Chaplin. Watch his tramp move through almost any scene, and he's consistently the smallest thing in motion. At 5'5", Chaplin made no attempt to disguise it or fade into the background. Instead, he built his entire comedic and emotional register around it, placing his small frame against environments and antagonists that were massive, rigid, and utterly indifferent to him. swallowed by grinding factory machinery in modern times, overmatched in the ring against a towering boxer in city lights. He even amplified the effect through costume, wearing clothes that visibly didn't fit, baggy trousers, a snug coat, oversized shoes, making his own body look even smaller, like a stranger wandering through a world in a borrowed suit. Where the studio system generally treated short stature as a flaw to be corrected through camera trickery, Chaplin grasped something more useful. Physical vulnerability is the fastest route to genuine audience empathy. Because his character was constantly forced to look up at a hostile world, viewers instinctively rooted for him. So when he eventually outwitted the towering cops or bullies or crushing machinery, the payoff landed as more than a simple gag. It read as the underdog beating the whole system. He needed no platform shoes and no clever lighting to win the screen. Full acceptance of his own limits was the entire strategy. Later filmmakers who tried to recreate that same underdog pathos rarely managed it, mostly because they cast actors who still, on some level, looked like they belonged on top. Audie Murphy, in a town that spent fortunes manufacturing fake tough guys, Audie Murphy was jarringly real. At just 5'5", slight, soft-spoken, and boyish, he had none of the towering frame of John Wayne or the weathered grit typically demanded of a Western hero. And by conventional casting logic, he should have been stuck playing the kid brother who needs rescuing. Instead, he became one of the era's most bankable Western and war picture stars, with no camera tricks required to sell his danger. The reason was invisible to the lens, but well known to audiences. Before he ever set foot on a studio lot, Murphy was one of the most highly decorated American combat soldiers of World War II. Studios weren't building him a tough guy persona from nothing. They were leaning on a reputation that already existed. That context reshaped how the camera read him. When he raised a weapon or stared down an opponent, the stillness and economy of his movement felt chillingly authentic, with none of the exaggerated swagger taller actors used to fake toughness. Beside him, classically handsome, larger co-stars could suddenly look like they were merely playing dress-up. Hollywood spent decades building risers and tilting lenses to manufacture giants. Audie Murphy is the reminder that the most convincing special effect in film is simply the real thing. No amount of set dressing or camera trickery was ever going to manufacture what he brought to a role without having to try. 14 actors, 14 very different solutions to the same basic problem, and about half of them never bothered solving it at all. The studios could dig trenches, build boxes, and tilt lenses all they wanted, but presence, it turns out, was never really about inches. What actually held these performances together was voice, timing, motion, and the specific way each of these people understood exactly what made them watchable, and then refused to apologize for the rest. The camera, in the end, was never measuring height. It was measuring attention, and every name on this list figured out how to earn it.